So what does it mean to get your giving in order? And we've been talking about giving for several weeks now and making reference to getting your giving in order. I've said that several times. So what does it mean? What does in order giving look like? How much are we supposed to give? Well, let's talk about that. And let's start by looking at 1 Corinthians 16, 1, 2, 3, where Paul says the following. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you have accredited by letter to carry your grace to Jerusalem. Now, the operative phrase here is, as God has prospered you. But what does that mean? And here's where people begin to have real belly aching ninny fits, saying, well, I don't know what it means, but I can tell you what it doesn't mean. It doesn't mean the tithe, because it can't mean the tithe, because we're free from the law. And boy, howdy, do people love being free from the law when it comes to tithing. Now, the same people tend to have conniption fits whenever someone talks about taking the Ten Commandments down from one of our halls of justice, because there's a great reverence and respect for Exodus 20:13, thou shalt not kill. But there's utter disdain for Malachi 3:10, bring ye all the tithes into the storehouse, that there may be meat in mine house. Never mind that both are ordained by God, that both are expressions of the greatest command, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. It has not escaped my attention that there are plenty of people in the church who love the law when it suits them, but hate it when it doesn't, and who play the free from the law card, usually only when it comes to money. Though oddly, sometimes people have very strong feelings about Sabbath keeping as well. Nevertheless, as insincere as the argument usually is, not always, but usually, it is a legitimate argument. We are free from the law. The law is not our master. The law is our tutor, our school master. That's what Paul tells us in Galatians 3:24. Therefore, the law was our schoolmaster to bring us unto Christ, that we might be justified by faith. So let me ask you something. Have you finished your education? Are you done learning? Have you reached perfection? Does your schoolmaster have nothing left to teach you? You know, back in the mid-1930s, the Metropolitan Opera House in New York established a rule: no encores. No matter how good a performance was, no matter how long the audience cheered, no matter how loudly or insistently the audience shouted for an encore, no encore was forthcoming. Even when Leontine Price brought the house down with La Canzone di Doretta from La Rondine, even though the audience applauded till some of them were bleeding from the hands, shouting and cheering for more than 14 minutes. And Miss Price was lying prostrate on the stage, sobbing because she was so humbled by their love and appreciation. No encore was given. It wasn't until 2008 when Juan Diego Flores tore the roof off the building by singing A Mess of Me from The Daughter of the Regiment, with more mastery, skill, and beauty than that shown by Pavarotti when he did the same in 1967. and the audience broke out in an utter melee that the artistic director called the pit and said, "Give the audience an encore." Now, this fellow, Juan Diego Flores, who's now heralded as the best tenor alive, he has a voice coach, a tutor, and he always will. Jon Rahm, the golfer, has a coach, a tutor. Caleb Dressel, the swimmer, has a coach. And the Apostle Paul had a coach, a tutor, the law. And he consulted her to guide his conscience constantly. And he tells us the law is our schoolmaster, our tutor. Now, which of us has better mastery of the mind of God than Juan Diego Flores has over his own voice? Which of us has better mastery over the seas of life's change than Caleb Dressel has over the waves of an Olympic pool? Which of us has better mastery over the trajectory of God's word at work in our lives than Jon Rahm has over the trajectory of a golf ball? Well, none of us, of course. Yet all of those people not only have tutors, but they listen to their tutors and heed their voice. And God gave us a tutor because we need a tutor. Now, those who protest are right. We are not beneath the law. But the law is not beneath us either. The law is beneath God. And we're beneath God. And God says, church, you would do well to listen to your older sister. I've told her some things that I haven't told you. And you still have her close at hand. She's right there for you to consult whenever you need to. So let's consult her. When Paul said you're to give as God has prospered you, he obviously intended to indicate proportional giving. He clearly intended that the amount that we give would have some relationship to what we've received, and that relationship would be a direct correspondence of some kind, that in some sense, what you give will be determined by what you have received. Now, the last time I taught a class on giving, someone asked me, well, why do I have to consider my giving in relation to my income? Why can't it just be whatever I've determined in my heart to give? Why does it have to be a percentage? And my answer was, and would be again, well, it will be a percentage of your income, no matter how you arrive at the figure. No matter what criteria you have used to determine what your gift should be, when you give it, it will be a portion of your income. I mean, let's say you make $100 a week. When the collection plate comes around, you give no thought as to what you'll give whatsoever. You simply reach in your pocket and throw in your loose change without even looking. Then even though you don't know the proportion your gift bears to your income, the fact of it remains. If it turns out that that handful of change adds up to exactly $1, then you've given 1% of your income, and you know that. The reason why we determine our giving by proportion to our income is because that's the criteria that God uses. Paul says, let your giving be done in proportion to what God has given you. So let's not pretend that proportional giving is foreign to the new covenant. Rather, let's follow what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 16 to its logical conclusion. After all, What proportion do you think Paul had in mind when he told us to give as God has prospered us? I mean, he didn't specify a portion, but he knew one, the one ordained by God in the document that Paul refers to as our God-appointed tutor. So let's consult our tutor and see what she has to say about this. Now, the simplest interpretation of the law is that the law, generally speaking, required that worshipers give a tithe. That is 10% on one's net annual income. And some Old Testament scholars find just that in the law of Moses, the command to give 10%. Now, there's actually much more to it than that. A careful reading of the Old Testament reveals that the letter of the law required more of the faithful than to give 10% of their net income, much more. Leviticus 27, 30 through 33, and all the tithe of the land, whether of the seed of the land or of the fruit of the tree, is the Lord's. It is holy unto the Lord. And if a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. And concerning the tithe of the herd or of the flock, even of whatsoever passes under the rod, the 10th shall be holy unto God. He shall not search whether it be good or bad, neither shall he change it. And if he change it at all, then both it and that for which it is changed shall be holy. It shall not be redeemed. Now, first I'd like to point out from this text that the statement that the tithe belongs to the Lord isn't a command. That isn't a law. It's a statement of fact. That statement isn't part of the law, properly speaking. It's a statement of fact, a premise on which the command is based. Now, Abraham recognized that, and Abraham comes long before the law. And he tithed because he knew that the tithe is holy to the Lord. The tithe belongs to the Lord, whether we give it to him or not. It's his. And according to Malachi 3, 8 through 9, we're thieves and robbers if we don't turn over to him what already belongs to him. Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with a curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. Second, we see that the tithe consists of the land, the seed of the land, the fruit of the tree, and the herds of the flocks, which covers just about everything. Because produce and livestock were the currency of exchange of the economy of the ancient Near East. The economy at the time of Moses was an agrarian barter economy, and in such an economy, crops and livestock were money. However, we should also note that though cash was dispreferred at the time of Moses, it was acceptable. But there was a surcharge for using cash. Leviticus 27:31, and if a man will redeem aught of his tithe, he shall add unto it a fifth part thereof. So if your 10th cow weighed 1,000 pounds, and beef on the hoof were 20 cents a pound, I know that's ridiculously cheap, but if it were that cheap, that animal would be worth $200. But if you wanted to keep that cow and give cash instead, you'd have to add a fifth part thereof. That is, you'd have to add 20% of its value. So you'd have to give $240 in its place. So the rate for the tithe is 10% if you give it in the usual currency of exchange of crops and livestock, but 12% if you want to give it in cash. But let's make it easy on ourselves. The math is easier if we stick with 10%. And cash is the usual currency of exchange of our society, so it could be argued that the surcharge should be added if we want to give our tithe in any form other than cash. So let's take that interpretation. Let's make it easy on ourselves and stick with 10% rather than 12%. Well, 10% of what? Well, according to verse 32 of Leviticus 27, 10% of that which passes under the rod. Now, the way that this was done is that the worshiper would put all of his livestock into a fold and then let them out through a narrow gate. And as they passed through, he counted, and every 10th one he touched with the rod, and that was part of the tithe. It was a tithe on what he actually had. Now, you may be saying, well, wait a minute. Some of those sheep aren't this year's sheep. Some of those are last year's sheep. They've already been counted once. I started off with 200 sheep this year, and now I've got 250. So my income for the year is only 50 sheep. I should only have to give 5 sheep, not 25. Well, your math and God's math are different. The tithe wasn't just on income, but was on holdings as well. Now, by the same token, suppose that your flock at one point in the year was 300 sheep strong, but you ate some of them and you sold some to pay some bills. Well, God didn't hold you accountable for the cost of doing business, just for your net profits, plus your holdings. So in modern terms, the tithe, if we were legally bound to it, and we're not legally bound to it, but if we were, then the tithe would be 10% of your net income, plus on an annual basis, 10% of what you have in the bank. And where did that tithe, the first tithe, go? Well, according to Numbers 18, 21 through 24, it went to the Levites. All of it. None of it was kept by the worshiper, and none of it went to charity. It all went to the Levites. And if you consult 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14 on this matter, you'll find that this corresponds with the church and the ministers thereof. 1 Corinthians 9, 13 through 14, do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. So by way of application, if we were bound by the law, the first tithe, 10% of your annual income and 10% of your holdings would go to the church. Now, what about charity? And what do you mean by first tithe? Were there 2 tithes? No, there were 3. The first tithe went to the Levites, which corresponds with the church. The second tithe, which is described in Deuteronomy 14, 22 through 27, was also a tithe of everything: crops, oil, wine, herds, flocks. However, it was a tithe on everything that was left after the first tithe. So it would actually be 10% less than the first tithe, or 9% of one's annual income. Now, an unspecified portion of this tithe was to be given to the Levites as a lanyap, as a gift over and above their ordinary income from the first tithe. But the primary purpose of this tithe was to pay for 3 pilgrimages a year, for 3 feasts: the Feast of Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, and the Feast of Weeks. Now, unlike the first tithe, the second tithe could be converted into cash without penalty. And this tithe the worshiper did partake in, and he could share it with anyone that he pleased, including the Levites. This money was for feasts dedicated to God. It's out of the second tithe that worshipers were to foot the bill for their offerings for these 3 feasts. That's how the Passover feast and all the sin offerings and guilt offerings and so on, and all the other feasts of the year were funded from the second tithe. They weren't deducted from the first tithe. They came from the second tithe. Now, the overall purpose of the sacred feast was to foster religious principles among the religious community at large. This had to do with teaching your faith to your children and celebrating your faith in fellowship with the faithful. But it also had to do with atoning for your sins through your giving, paying your vows, and paying your penalties. One time someone asked me, well, I spent a great deal of money sending my kids to Christian schools. Can that count as part of my giving? Now, again, I'm not, I'm not trying to, you don't have to ask me for permission. I'm not trying to be legalistic here. You aren't legally obligated in your giving under the New Testament. But having said that, if you are disposed to allow your tutor to inform your conscience about your giving, you're free to follow that model. And with this in mind, I said, yes, but if you want to be faithful to the model, don't deduct it from your first tithe. That goes to the church. All of it, full stop. No, deduct it from your second tithe. The second tithe of the Old Testament symbolizes in type and shadow your giving to Christian causes that go beyond your commitment to the local congregation. So it can go to Christian causes and causes that promote Christian values. And since you're allowed to partake in the joy of your giving of the second tithe, then money from this tithe could go to things like a $1,000 a plate fundraising dinner, or to buy Girl Scout cookies, or to buy Christmas gifts, or Easter seals, or to sponsor rubber duckies in a charity rubber ducky race, or whatever. So if you were setting aside money for this second tithe, you'd have a built-in budget for every kind of planned giving over and above what you give to the church. And since this tithe is also for paying your vows and penalties, then if you get a speeding ticket, you've already got the money set aside for that. And I think that if you want to make political contributions, that's where that money should come from also, from your second tithe. And then there's the third tithe. The third tithe is described in Deuteronomy 14:28-29. And that tithe was specifically for charity, specifically for almsgiving, for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Now that tithe was also 10% of one's income, but of course, it comes out after the first tithe and the second tithe. So it's really only about 8% of your income. And mercifully, it was given only once every 3 years. So on an annualized basis, the third tithe comes to only about 3% of one's annual income. Now, just to be clear, 3% is rounded up, not down. You could just as easily go with 2% or 2.5%. But let's go ahead and round up, since in addition to the third tithe, all Israelites were also required to leave gleanings of the fields for the poor. So the third tithe is for the homeless guy at the gas station who asked for a few dollars. It's for the person in line behind you at the drive-thru whose bill you pay spontaneously. It's for the exceptionally generous tip that you leave for the charmless and forlorn server who gave you adequate service and is clearly in real need of a blessing today. It's for the person in front of you in line at the grocery store whose EBT card has just been rejected, and they're about to be embarrassed by having to put their groceries back. That's the third tithe. Now, when you read the biblical record on these tithes, you may find it difficult to distinguish between the three tithes. But we have ample testimony that this is the way the law was known and understood in first century Palestine. For instance, in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 4, Section 240, Josephus says, "Beside those two tithes, which I already said you are to pay every year, the one for the Levites, the other for the festivals, you are to bring every third year a tithe to be distributed to those that want, to women that are widows, and to children that are orphans." So if we wanted to maintain that same standard for ourselves, And again, we're not legally obligated to. But if you wanted for the Old Testament to be your tutor and to guide you in your giving, we would be giving about 22% of our net income and holdings, giving 10% directly to the church, to our local congregation, 9% for things like Christian education, missions, Christmas gifts, causes that directly advance the Christian enterprise, and 3% for the poor. Now, at this point, you may be saying to yourself, good grief. I mean, I came here hoping that Joe would say something about tithing, but not this, because 10% of my income is simply too much for me to give. Now I'm told that the tithe of the Old Testament was actually 22%. Thank God we are free from the law. We really dodged a bullet there. And you're right, 10% does seem like a lot if you're not used to giving that much and if you're not disposed to do so. And 22% seems astronomical, unless you take into account that most of that additional 12% is for stuff that you're already spending money on. And you're right, we are free from the law. Paul simply said to give as God has prospered you. No one's legally obligated to give any specific amount under the new covenant. Under the new covenant, we believe that we are bound by conscience to do only whatever we receive by command, example, or necessary inference. So let's take a look at some New Testament examples of giving and see what we find. In Matthew 19:21, we find the following. Jesus said unto him, If thou wilt be perfect, go and sell all that thou hast, and give to the poor, and thou shalt have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Now, here Jesus isn't recommending the tithe of the Old Testament. He's recommended the giving of 100%. Now, this, of course, is what Jesus said to the rich young ruler. And frankly, no one really takes what Jesus said to that guy personally. No one takes that seriously. No, this is what Jesus said to that guy to do, but it's because he had a problem. He was rich, and apparently he was also selfish. So Jesus told him what he needed to do to attain unto perfection. But that doesn't really apply to me. I'm not rich. I'm not selfish. So yes, Jesus told one guy to give 100%, but surely he didn't mean for all of us to give 100%. Well, you're probably right about that. Though he did have high praise for those who did give that amount. Mark 12:41 through 44. And Jesus sat over against the treasury and beheld how the people cast money into the treasury. And many that were rich cast in much. And there came a certain poor widow, and she threw in 2 mites, which make a farthing. And he called unto him his disciples and said unto them, Verily I say unto you, that this poor widow has cast more in than all the others which have cast into the treasury. For all they did cast in of their abundance, but she of her want did cast in all that she had, even all her living. Jesus clearly had a high level of appreciation for this woman because she gave 100%. Now, believe it or not, I've actually heard people say, well, it's easier to give when you don't really have anything. If I was in that woman's position, I'd give 100% too. Really? Would you? Well, some Christians would. And some Christians have. Acts 2:44 through 45 and 4:32 through 35. And all that believed were together and had all things in common, and sold their possessions and goods, and parted them all, parted them to all men, as every man had need. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own. But they had all things in common. With great power gave the apostles witness of the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. Neither was there any among them that lacked, for as many as were possessors of lands or houses sold them, and brought the prices of the things that were sold, and laid them down at the apostles' feet, and distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. Under the new covenant, we're free from the law. We're not under the law. We're under grace. The first Christians understood that. According to Acts 4:33, great grace was upon them all. And having been set free from the law, free from the tithe, and placed under grace, what did they do? Well, just like so many modern Christians, they decided that tithing was unacceptable. They wouldn't be subject to the law. They wouldn't be caught dead tithing. Wouldn't be caught dead giving 22% of their income. That would nullify grace if they were to bind themselves to the law that way. And they certainly wouldn't be caught dead giving 10% of their income. No way. They weren't slaves to the law. The only acceptable thing for them to do was to give 100%. Now, Joe, it isn't fair. I mean, these were firsthand witnesses of the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the Pentecost. Surely they were caught up in a fervor. You can't call this kind of giving normative for the church. You're right about that. I don't call that kind of giving normative for the church. I happen to be of the opinion that that kind of giving is impractical in the extreme and is ultimately unsustainable. I think that's one of the reasons for some of the problems that they had in the Jerusalem church. Peter, James, and John had a nickname for themselves, a title of honor for themselves. They called themselves the poor. And where did that name come from? Well, at least in part, it came from the fact that the Jerusalem church isolated itself from society and became a closed community with a communal economy. And eventually they were poor because everybody sold all that they have, gave their liquid assets to the church, and then quit their jobs and let the church support them. And if you know anything about economic theory, you know that that won't work for very long. It's unsustainable in the long run. Now, Paul didn't do that. Paul planted churches that remained intact in the society at large. The church members remained employed, remained productive members of society, and gave week to week. And how much did they give? Well, we don't have good records on that. We only have that kind of information from one of Paul's congregations, the Macedonians. 2 Corinthians 1, 8 through 4. That isn't right. 2 Corinthians 8, 1 through 4. Moreover, brethren, we do you to wit of the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the fulfillment of their purpose. For I bear witness that according to their power, yes, and beyond their power, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would take into our hands the grace they were sowing, and so participate together with them in ministering to the holy ones. Well, how much did the Macedonians give? Not 10%, not 22%, not 100%. They gave 110%. They gave beyond their means. They didn't just give more than they could afford. The language here strongly indicates that they gave more than they even had. They borrowed money to give to the church. That's what freedom from the law produces in people who want to give. But believe it or not, there's one person in the Bible who gave even more than that. In Luke 10, you've got the story of the Good Samaritan. Now, the Samaritan didn't give all that he had, at least not right away. Instead, and you know the story, he writes a blank check. He gave the innkeeper his promise that he would pay the bill for taking care of this injured man, whatever the cost might be. Now, can you imagine that? Offering to pay someone's hospital bill, no matter how much it came to? And this guy wasn't just going to be there a day or two. Remember, he was beaten till he was half dead. The Samaritan opened himself up to unlimited liability. So the potential was there for him to give 100% of what he had and then some for years to come. Now, I could give more examples, but no more are needed. You get the idea. Paul's command to all the churches is that week by week we're to give, and that giving is to be done proportionally, as God has prospered us. And I started this lesson with the question, well, what proportion does Paul have in mind? And since Paul's words are God-breathed, what proportion does God have in mind? Well, the answer is, if you let the Old Testament inform your conscience, then the very least, the starkest interpretation of God's intention and expectation of what the faithful will give is 10% of one's net income. If you let the New Testament inform your conscience on this matter, the possibilities are endless. They start with the giving of lands and houses, and then go to 100%, and with faith, beyond 100%. So how much should you give? Well, that's between you and God. I don't know how much anybody in this congregation gives, and I don't want to know. The purpose of this lesson is to inform your conscience and to set the bar ditches. What we receive under the new covenant is far superior to what the Israelites received under the old covenant. And frankly, I don't know how any Christian in good conscience determines in their heart that they ought to give less as faithful Christians than what was given by faithful Jews. On the other end of the spectrum, I'm too practical and perhaps too fearful. Not faithful enough to give 100% of my income and just allow God to take care of me. Frankly, I think that my income is the means by which God takes care of me financially, and I simply can't see my way clear to give 100%. But how much should you give? I don't know. Not exactly. But my best counsel is that the right amount for you to give lies somewhere between 10% of your net income and 100% of your net income. But you have to work out the details between you and God. Philippians 2:12-13, wherefore, my beloved, as ye have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Beloved, it's up to you to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. That's my lesson for today.